historically accurate or reliable. Let me tell you, Luke was one of the greatest historians that ever walked the face of the earth. The book of Acts is his greatest work of history. His gospel is a great, great work of faith, detailing the life of Jesus from a physician's perspective. And each one of the Gospels had a different lens they were looking through as they recounted them. So Luke, Acts are written by Luke, the physician and also a amateur historian. Okay, back to our text. And I'm going to get my glasses out. I should have had them out last week. When I have trouble reading stuff, I just make up words. I just make them what is being said there. Okay, now we're in better shape. All right. The next day we were being violently storm-tossed and began to jettison the cargo. And on the third day they threw the ship's tackle overboard with their own hands. That's the stuff that helps them manage the ship's sailing. Since neither sun nor stars appeared for many days and no small storm assailed us, from then on all hopes of being saved was gradually abandoned by everyone except Paul. When they had gone a long time without food, Paul stood up in their midst and said, "Men, you ought to have followed my advice and not have set sail from Crete and incurred this damage and loss. Yet now I urge you to keep up your courage, for there will be no loss of life among you, but only of this ship. For this very night an angel of God, to whom I belong and who I serve, stood before me, saying, 'Do not be afraid. Paul, you must stand before Caesar. And behold, God has granted to you all those who are sailing with you. Therefore keep up your courage, men, for I believe God that it will turn out exactly as I've been told. But we must run aground on a certain island.'" So God had laid out the whole scenario of what was going to happen soon. They're going to lose the boat. They're going to run aground. They're going to go to a certain island that Paul was going to be directed to, a certain island that's going to have significance in the story of Christianity for centuries. But Paul said, "Be of good courage. We're going to all survive." And when the 14th night came, as we were being driven about in the Adriatic Sea, about midnight the sailors began to surmise that they were approaching some land. I guess the God of Paul is coming through. They took soundings and found it to be 20 fathoms. And a little farther on they took another sounding and found it to be 15 fathoms. So they're getting closer to land. They can see the edge of land coming down into the water. Fearing that we might run aground somewhere on the rocks, they cast 4 anchors from the stern which wished for daybreak. But as the sailors were trying to escape, as the sailors are trying to leave all the people except themselves on board and go for land themselves because they didn't think they were going to make it. They didn't believe Paul's words. As the sailors were trying to escape from the ship and had let down the ship's small boat into the sea on the pretense of attending to lay out anchors from the bow, Paul said to the centurion and the soldiers, "Unless these men remain aboard, you yourselves cannot be saved. It's all of us or none of us." Then the soldiers cut away the ropes of the ship's boat and let it fall away because Captain Paul had told them what to do, and they were listening. Until the next day was about to dawn, Paul was encouraging them all to take some food, saying, "Today is the 14th day that you have been constantly watching and going without and eating and have taken nothing. Therefore I encourage you to take some food, for this is for your preservation, for not a hair from the head of any of you will perish." Having said this, he took some bread and did a kind of a modified communion. Took some bread and gave thanks and passed it out to the people on board, and they all partook of it. All were encouraged, and they took food. All of us in the ship were 276 persons. And when they'd eaten enough, they began to lighten the ship by throwing out the wheat into the sea. The cargo that was going to pay for the voyage is now thrown overboard. And when day came, they could not recognize the land, and they did not observe a bay with a beach, but they resolved to drive the ship onto it if they could. And casting off the anchors, they left them in the sea, while at the same time they were loosening the ropes or the rudders and hoisting the foresail into the wind. They were heading towards the beach. But striking a reef where two seas meet, they ran the vessel aground, and the prow stuck fast and remained immovable, but the stern began to be broken by the force of the waves. The soldiers' plan was to kill the prisoners, so that none of them would swim away and escape, but the centurion, wanting to bring Paul safely through, kept them from their attention, and commanded that those who could swim should jump overboard first and get to land, and the rest should follow, some on planks, others on various things from the ship. And so it happened that they were all brought safely to land. So here's a place where they believe the two oceans met. And it's coming from the bay. Back here is the Bay of St. Paul, which those going on tour with me will be staying in the Bay of St. Paul, which is very close to this. This is a statue dedicated to St. Paul on a little tiny island that juts out. They were wrecked probably somewhere around here, somewhere in this little island, and they swam to shore anywhere they could find themselves. But this is the site that most people feel is described in Luke's writings, where they erected this wonderful statue. So we're in Malta now, my favorite place in the whole world. Why? Because there were knights there. Ancient civilizations. Napoleon invaded. The Germans bombed and the Italians bombed. Oh, this is just a place of great history. The Phoenicians were there. I mean, on and on. Malta is a wonderful place. A place of strategic purpose in God's plan for advancing the gospel. Let's see what happens here as we're now on land in Malta. Glasses back on, if you please. And when they had been brought safely through, then we found that we were on an island called Malta. The natives showed us extraordinary kindness, for because of the rain had set in and because of the cold, they kindled a fire and received us all. Hey guys, come hang out with us. Maybe God was using you to bring all this rain, because very little rain falls in Malta. And when a northeasterner comes and dumps rain, they are really, really excited. And they built so many cisterns to hold the water that falls during the few and far between times of rain, that they were thankful. We complain if we have a day of rain like yesterday. But they were just so excited. It was raining, we'll have water to plant for our crops. But look what happens here in verse 3. When Paul had gathered a bundle of sticks and laid them on the fire, a viper came out because of the heat and fastened itself upon his hand. Man, most people would be frightened to death. Carolyn was walking the other night and saw a snake on the path and ran home holding herself because she was so scared. People don't like snakes. Viper attaches to his hand. Oh, yeah, there's a viper there. I'm going to Rome. Nothing's going to happen to me. And see what happens. He picks it up. The natives think, well, this man's cursed. He's a murderer. He's been saved from the sea, but the viper's going to take him. Verse 5, he shook the creature off into the fire and suffered no harm. Well, this obviously was a deadly, deadly viper, because they thought he would be dead instantly. And they were expecting he was about to swell up and suddenly fall down dead. But after they had waited a long time and had seen nothing unusual begin to happen to him, they changed their minds and began to say he was a god. No, that was a mistake. But now in the neighborhood of that place were lands belonging to the leading man of the island named Publius. Okay, and this is the great citadel, Medina, on a high point on the island. That just means city, not Medina like that in Saudi Arabia, but Mdina, and it means city. And in this city was where the people of importance, the leaders, the governors, the high rollers lived inside the city walls. It wasn't built like this then. It was much different, but it began over years to grow and grow and grow, and became very significant in the Great Siege of Malta, because the forces of Suleiman the Magnificent said, we can take that later. We don't have to give any attention to that. That's prime pickings. Let's go for the hard places first. But they left this, and inside this city wall there were some Knights of Malta, a small garrison of them, and some soldiers who had proved to be decisive in the defense of Malta during the siege. Now, inside was the house of Publius. Now there's a church, obviously, built over where his home was, because that's what you always did. This church is actually rebuilt in many ways. After the bombing raids of the Luftwaffe, only these two towers and a couple of columns were left, but the people rebuilt it, and it's a pretty well-known site in Malta. A lot of tourist traffic goes there, because Publius became the bishop of Malta. He not only became a believer, but he became the head of the Christian church in Malta. And the Christian church in Malta was very active from the time of Paul on to the time of the Great Siege. So look here in verse 8. And it happened that the father of Publius was lying in bed afflicted with recurrent fever and dysentery, and Paul went in to see him, and after he had prayed, he laid his hands on him and healed him. His father is suddenly standing up and healthy, and one more affirmation that what this guy is saying, it's got to be the truth, because God is taking his words and adding supernatural power to them. And after this had happened, the rest of the people on the island who had diseases and were coming to him were getting cured. And they also honored us with many marks of respect. And when we were all setting sail, they supplied us with all we needed. And they were there 3 months in Malta. Well, that was the first part of the Malta miracle. There are many miracles in Malta, but the next one is my favorite, so I'm going to wax eloquent on the Great Siege of Malta, if you don't mind. All right. This is a, look on your maps here. Let's go to your maps. This is an artist's recreation of the Great Siege. And as Ken was looking at it, he couldn't decide what that was all about. And he wanted me to explain it to him, and I said, no, you're going to have to wait. And so now, here's the explanation. Wherever you see a cross, a red backing and a white cross, that's where the Knights of St. John had a garrison or a fort. You'll only see 3. You'll see one at the end of the island here, called Fort St. Elmo. And then you'll see another here in the middle, in Brigau. And, well, yeah, there's a tiny flag here in Zenglai. So these are the places that were being besieged. It's estimated that Suleiman the Magnificent, in 1565, because he wanted Malta to take his faith, the Islamic faith, to the world. He was an ardent follower of the Quran, and he believed that those who didn't accept it could either be killed or forced to accept it or enslaved. It was taught in the book. A lot of people say, well, you know, the Crusades are evil. What the Christians did in the Crusades were evil. Look, they killed all those people. They went back to Israel, and they got in all kinds of skirmishes and retook castles and did this and that. Keep this in mind, that when the Prophet Muhammad became the leader, the de facto leader of the Muslim faith, was in the 600s, middle of the 600s. He's doing this to the rest of the world. He's overtaking Christian Egypt, where the Coptic church flourished, and most of the extant copies of the New Testament, Greek New Testament, were found there. He took over he took over Christian Syria, Christian Lebanon, Christian Ethiopia, the top of North Africa, where we find Libya now, where Tunisia and those places are. Christian, and they went in and they killed and they advanced their gospel by the sword and forced people to either accept it, be enslaved, or expelled from their cities. The Crusades were, at best, I would describe a defensive response to the cries of their brothers. And they came and they tried to liberate places that were once Christian strongholds, which had now been besieged, and terrible things had been done. One of the great groups of people that were involved in the Crusades were the Knights of St. John. And they had the red robes with the white cross that you see here. They were the only crusaders really to last for a number of centuries. After the actual Crusades, they continued on in Rhodes, island of Rhodes, which was defeated by Suleiman the Magnificent. And they eventually found themselves, they were offered by the King of Spain, they were offered the island of Malta. And so they went there and they began to build defensive fortifications, anticipating the day would come when the Muslim hordes would want to take more and more of the world. They had advanced into Spain. They advanced to the gates of Vienna. They had taken over a lot of Hungary. They were just moving with force to take their ideology to the world by violence. How did they get their soldiers to work so hard? The soldiers were promised this, not only stuff in the afterlife, but as they came in, they were allowed to sack and loot for a few days. Certain things were set aside for Suleiman and his generals, but they were allowed to take people, possessions, and riches as soon as they defeated or took over the cities. Now this appeals to the basest part of men without God. They want women, and they want wealth, and they want power. And they were getting it all through the book of God that their leader was telling them to follow. Well, at Malta in 1565, Suleiman the Magnificent says, I got to have that island. He put together about 40,000 men, 300 ships, 6,000 cannons that ultimately would fire over 1,600 or 16,000 cannonballs. One huge cannon could shoot a cannonball 2 miles, 160-pound cannonballs. This was the same group of people with the same strategy that took over Constantinople through cannons and force and turned that into modern-day Istanbul. So there they are. And what did they see at the beginning of 1964? They saw the ships coming over the horizon. Hundreds of them. Hundreds of them. They pulled the great chain over the bay. Now, let me see if I got some more pictures here. I should go back to this. This is the gate. This is the fortification that existed there. There were 3 cities They called them the three cities of defense. There was Brigou, which is the one that has Fort St. Angelo we'll talk about in a second. Sengele, which was another one that pointed out on a little peninsula. And then Bormia, which was a city that was attached to Brigou. This is the gate that would lead into the city attached to Brigou. And then there was another fortification on one of these peninsulas. We'll look at those pictures in a second. I mean, they're digging in. I guess I always point that in the wrong way. This is Fort St. Elmo. And this you're going to find in your picture here is, am I holding that right? Yeah. It's right here at the top. Okay? There's a chain that went across it. And Fort St. Angelo was the first line of defense for any invasion, anybody coming up the Grand Harbor of Malta.
They put a chain across the...
A huge chain across it. No ships could come in. Huh?
Across the water?
Yeah. Yeah. Well, there's a big chain. They had one in Constantinople as well. It was a strategy that they used to keep ships from coming into the harbor. So here you've got this Fort St. Elmo, which was the hardest place to defend because it was all by itself on the end of this peninsula. So here's the end of the peninsula right here. These three cities are over here. We'll talk about them in a second. The end of the peninsula, Fort St. Elmo, the high ground, which we know in military terms, is always the ground you want to have. This land right here, above Fort St. Elmo, where modern-day Valletta is, was the high ground. And so in came these hordes of Suleiman the Magnificent. He gave himself that name, by the way. Had a little pride. They put their cannons up. They established their tents, their ships, all their supplies were brought in. They began hammering Fort St. Elmo. Fort St. Elmo had 50 knights of St. John. 50 knights and another 200 soldiers from Spain. They had 250 people there. And they thought the fort would fall within a day, at best, 3 days or whatever. And Jean Valette, the leader of the Knights of St. John, was across the bay, and he says, "You've got to hold on. I've sent ships out asking for rescue. They're going to come anytime soon. You've got to hold on. You've got to fight to the last man." They would send swimmers across the bay to communicate to one another. Suleiman the Magnificent had several generals. Pasha was one of the key ones, and he decided he would send wave after wave of soldiers against those walls and overpower them. The Janissaries, the elite crack Muslim soldiers, the stormtroopers of Islam, they had long flowing robes, and they had curved swords that they carried, and they had piercing cries that would cause people to just melt in fear. They swarmed down, and they had long arquebuses or early muskets. They had long muskets that they were very accurate with. The Knights of St. John and the defenders had shorter ones, but they were accurate too. And they waited, and as they came, they began to pick them off. And they used methods that were unconventional. They took hoops, dipped them in linseed and different kinds of oils, and set them on fire and rolled them down into the midst of the Janissaries with their long flowing robes, as they rushed into battle. Thousands died, and they held on. Not for a week, not for 2 weeks, but for a month and a half. They faced constant bombardment from the cannon and constant assaults against the wall, and they kept fighting. They kept fighting. Meanwhile, across the bay, they're strengthening their defenses, and they're praying that the relief will come. Here's the problem: Christendom was not united, and few people cared in Christendom that the Muslims were coming because they couldn't agree on anything. You had in England, you had Elizabeth I, who was marshaling this new faith, this Anglican faith her father had started, and she wasn't too keen on helping Catholics out. You had the... Your question is? Elizabeth I. Remember, King Henry VIII wanted sons, didn't get any, but he got a great queen, And so, they weren't interested. Neither was Philip of Spain. Neither was Maximilian II of Bavaria. And on. The Pope didn't care all that much. And they couldn't decide how they were going to help. And so they let them fight by themselves. And so Fort St. Elmo fell. And when it fell, the Muslims put the heads of the fallen knights on spikes and put them on the wall. The response by Jean Follett and the defenders of the remaining garrisons was to take prisoners and put their heads in their cannons and shoot them back. This was a battle to the end. There was no holds barred. So, Fort St. Elmo falls. 2,000 of the 40,000 have died. Well, here's this didn't fall. This is Bregu, and here at the end is where the Crusaders had their church, where the Grand Master's palace was at that time. Back here was that gate the defense gate back here into the first city, the second defense into the second city. They were ready. They were ready to the point where assault after assault, cannon fire after cannon fire, they would knock walls down during the day, and in the night the citizens of the city would refill the walls, and it infuriated the invaders. They thought they were making progress, and it didn't seem to happen. They couldn't cause the walls to fall. Now, if you'll notice, that's this one right here, okay, where Fort St. Angelo is. Right here is another finger that goes out. That's one of the three cities. That's Sengele. It did fall eventually. And they were afraid. Let me see if I got a picture of that. Well, here they are. They put a bridge across and another chain. These were connected. And they were afraid that the Muslims would come from here across the water. Let me go back to this other one. And they did have a plan. They were going to assault at night in mass with lots of boats, a frontal assault on Fort St. Angelo. Fortunately, divine providence, Jean Follett was prepared. And at the base of this, we've walked this. Carolyn, I made her walk one day more miles than she'd like. We walked around the base of this, and I kept looking for the place on the base where they had hidden cannons hidden into the walls here. And as these Muslim ships began sneaking in, they thought, we've got it, we've got them. They're not prepared for us. They get close to the shore, the cannon gates open, and they just bombard, taking down 30 ships and all the people inside it. Swimmers swam ashore, and the defenders of Fort St. Angelo came out and slaughtered them in the water. Now, tens of thousands are going to begin dying of these Muslim invaders from one assault after another. A relief force does come, a small, tiny relief force comes, and they sneak in by the hand of God this way, and they make it in, and they come through that double gate we saw. 187 soldiers were all that were brave enough to come from Spain. And they're fighting, and they're fighting, and they're fighting. All hope was about lost. The forces of Islam knew that they couldn't last much longer because they were running out of provision. Malaria was killing them. It was a desperate time, and one last siege would stop them. If they could push over the walls, they would take Malta forever. What happened was this. Those few nights that were in Medina, with some of the soldiers that were stationed there, decided it's time to lead a flank attack. They opened the gates of Medina and they came down, and the Muslims thought the relief force has landed. And they came down and they began slaughtering the rear guard of the forces of Suleiman the Magnificent. Panic began to ensue. And they began to run back thinking, we've lost, the relief forces come. What's interesting is when the battle was almost over, and one of the second miracles of Malta was happening, they could see sails over the horizon of another relief force coming. And with that, the forces of Suleiman, after suffering tens of thousands in defeat, got on their ships and began to sail away. Little did they know that that was just a few hundred people. And they stayed out there for a long time in the ocean because they were afraid that they would lose. And so God worked a great miracle. Why was that so important? Well, because that was a major setback to Suleiman. And he turned his attention now back towards Hungary and that part of the world close to where his Turkey was. And it slowed the advance of Islam into Europe. The Spanish expelled eventually in the Reconquista, they expelled the Muslims in Spain. Charles Martel defeated a Spanish force at the gates of Tours in France, and they began to be pushed back. God raised up the Mongols with Genghis Khan, and they began to raid and invade the whole of the Ottoman Empire. And with that, the force of Islam was stopped, opening the door for the advancement of the gospel further on. By the time World War II came along, let me get to my pictures here. I think I missed a couple. Those, again, Fort St. Angelo, part of the three cities. From the air, you can see a better picture of it. We're going to get to Syracuse in just a second. Syracuse is good too. But in World War II, another miracle happened. This was going to be an important launching point to stop the Axis powers. They had to hold Malta, or the Axis powers, that is Germany, Japan, and Italy, could have won the war. Because this island was where all the planes that would fight in southern Italy and fight to keep Sicily from being overtaken was necessary to hold. So during World War II, this was the most bombed place in the history of mankind. Bomb after bomb after bomb after bomb fell on Malta. And they held on and they held on. They had a few planes, British Spitfires, that went up and did the best they could. They had one great pilot, let me see his name, George Bruling, who shot down 27 German planes. He's called the Great Knight of Malta in that century. He also went on after this war to sign up to fly planes into Israel. No one was giving them any planes to fight the Arabs that were trying to come in. 6 days after the nation Israel was granted independence, 1948, he was ushering planes into Israel, and his plane was sabotaged, and he went down in the ocean. He's buried with great honor at the foot of Mount Carmel. If you're ever there, you can see it. We walked by that when we were at Mount Carmel one day. Well, anyway, all these things are happening. Malta's about to fall again. They have no oil, no gasoline, no petrol for their planes, no way to defend the island, no food. The people are starving to death. And so Roosevelt says, we'll send a ship, the Ohio, and it's loaded with petrol. It's loaded with food. The Germans knew it was coming. They torpedoed it about 90 miles from Malta, and it began to list. The British sent in two frigates and came alongside it as it was listing like this in the water. They supported it and took it all the way up the Grand Harbor, resupplying the airplanes, feeding the people, stopping, once again, forces of evil from taking over that part of the world. Meantime, Patton and Montgomery are racing, I guess it's more this way, Montgomery and Patton are racing, up Sicily, and unimpeded, because there's no airplanes anymore that can come and take them out. Well, none that could be taken from Malta. Great story of another miracle of Malta. Now, why do I say all this? I think God tells us that the kings of the world are like channels of water in his hands, that he moves kings and kingdoms. He allows things to happen for his own glory and for his own purpose and for his own advancement. And it wasn't time in God's great plan for a religion that was really anti-God to take over the world. I think what we're seeing today is more of a fulfillment of Suleiman the Great's dream for Islam to make advances into the world. I was watching an interesting video by John MacArthur while he was alive. He was talking about, he believed with all his heart that the Antichrist and the forces that were going to come and attack Israel in the end times were a Muslim force, that Antichrist was Muslim, and that they would come down with all these armies to descend upon the promised land to eradicate the Jewish people once and for all. But unfortunately, according to the future plans, Jesus intervenes in that plan and stops them. We've got some danger in the world today, and instead of being afraid of what's happening in Europe, it's happening in Canada, it's happening in our own country, the incursion of radical Islam, we should say, maybe God, this is part of your plan, and we're witnessing the last great unfolding of the epic battle between good and evil in our time. I don't know, but we need to pray. If it's not, we need to pray for a great revival that would stop it. But more so, we need to pray, nevertheless, your will be done, God, not mine. We're all saddened to see the decline of what was once so important, our faith in our country. To see where our brothers and sisters in Canada, pastors cannot read from the Bible passages that are offensive to Muslims or to homosexuals because it's a protected class. That's the march towards the end. There could be another Malta miracle, and I hope there is in our country and in Europe, but I'm not holding my breath. Europe is resisting God, and faith there is on the decline in huge numbers. All the hard work, we're not in questions yet, we'll get there. All the hard work that was done to stop the advance of an ungodly religion is being undone by lazy people who've walked away from their faith, people who've given up on their God and now allow anything to happen in the world. If I were in Canada, I'd be in jail right now. All right, let's move on to Syracuse. Syracuse it is. I point the wrong direction every single time. Every single time. Okay, he says this in verse 11. At the end of 3 months, we set sail in an Alexandrian ship which had wintered on the island, and we had and which had the twin brothers for its figurehead. And we put in at Syracuse and stayed there for 3 days. 3 days in Syracuse. Well, you wouldn't think a lot could be done in 3 days. But in 37 AD, Peter and Paul together in Antioch, where Christians were first called Christians, sent a man, a believer, a new convert named Marcion to Syria to start a work there. He got there and he began preaching the gospel, leading people to Christ. History tells us that the first Christians in Syracuse met in caves around the city of Syracuse. They met in the caves where we're going to visit, those who are going on the tour, where the ear of Dionysius is. And they met there out of fear for being persecuted for their faith. They met in these caves, and they grew strong. They grew strong, and they grew united. And so when Paul comes, there's a group of people there who have, in almost 30 years, developed a cohesive, strong, powerful church. And it wasn't this church, but this is a part of the archaeological park in Syracuse, where the caves are close by that. But this is the church that was developed in years to come in Syracuse. And I think it's really cool that on the top of these pillars, this is Marcion and Paul. And these are the two people that they venerate in this church that is the Cathedral of Syracuse. Marvelous advancement of the gospel there. Paul stayed there 3 days and I think provided really good encouragement and support. So, where does that take us? It takes us now down to verse 13. And after that we sailed around and arrived at Rhegium, and a day later a south wind sprung up, and on the second day we came to get my glasses on here. We came to Puteoli. We found some brethren, and we were invited to stay with them for 7 days. And that is Naples. They arrived at the seaport of Naples. So God has taken Paul from Jerusalem to Caesarea, all the way through the Mediterranean to Malta, where a church is established. By the way, these guys are all martyred that I've mentioned for their faith. They eventually were martyred. Syracuse, church established. But when he gets to Rome, when he gets to Italy, he's going to find brethren all up and down the coast, because the word of God had spread. Why did God have to get Paul to Rome? Because all roads led to Rome. The Appian Way, the Ignatian Way, the Ostian Way, they all led to Rome. It was the capital of the world. It enforced the Pax Romana, the peace of the world. The language spread, the civilization spread. Rome was the key. And if God could get his choice apostle to Rome to infiltrate the highest echelons of Roman leadership, which he did, the gospel would take hold in a city which later called itself the Vatican City. I mean, the epicenter of the Roman Catholic faith. But you know, that didn't happen for about 700 years. Okay? There wasn't a Roman Catholic church. There was just the one Catholic church, the one universal church. But its new headquarters was Rome. Man, kind of hard to teach with children having so much fun, but I'd rather have them have fun then you'd be able to hear what I'm saying, because they're the next generation that are going to take the gospel to the world.
We can hear you.
Yeah.
We're fine.
Okay, well, I don't know sometimes. All right, questions. And I've been told I have to repeat the questions because people who are watching at home didn't know what the questions were. So, raise your hand, state your question, and then I will repeat it if I can. If there are no questions, we're done. No, I can't.
Did you say that this Putio or whatever that is, that's Naples?
Yes, that's where they landed. That's the question
That's
is.
nowadays Naples.
Yes, the question is, when you look down here in the text, and it says, we sailed around and we arrived at Rhegium, and a day later the wind sprang up, and the second day we came to Puteoli. Rhegium is where Sicily and Italy meet. There was a city there. Okay, so the Puteoli, that is a real hard one when you run all those vowels together, and I'm trying to, I should have rehearsed that. That's the seaport of Naples. Yes?
Paul was a prisoner this whole time, right?
Paul was a prisoner this whole time.
And then they were taking him to Rome to put him in the cell eventually, right?
Yeah, and we're going to get to that next week. We're going to find his first imprisonment next week. And it says, the verse right after this says, "In this way we came to Rome." So now what he's going to do, he's going to head up the Appian Way, this great super highway for its time, and with a cohort that's taking him there. And on the way, he'll see Christians coming to meet him. And then he'll come under a great arch and come into Rome and be stationed at temporarily at a praetorian guard palace, and then taken into his own private housing. So we'll get to that. Okay. Other questions? Ken, 2 questions? Okay.
Two. So, you talked about how you read that quote about how detailed this journey was,
Yeah.
and how he got all these details and the depths and stuff like that, and the seaports. How did he come up with all that? I think of how it was portrayed in the movie Chosen, where Matthew went around with a pen and paper and recorded everything. Do you think that Dr. Luke had like a pencil and a piece of paper and had a journal and journaled all this? Is that how he came up with it?
Well, let me ask you this question. Did Dr. Luke have a pen and paper, and was he journaling on the voyage? And the answer would be, would you be journaling if you're being inundated by waves?
I wouldn't.
He journeyed when they landed at places.
Okay.
Yeah. He wasn't Superman.
You'd have to keep that in a plastic bag.
Yeah, Carter.
So the church we're looking at in a map on this, is that Syracuse?
This church right here,
So you said Syracuse, but is it in Italian? Is it Syracuse?
this is the cathedral in Syracuse, and they have a different name for it probably on your map, but it's called the.
It's on the western end of.
Yeah, it's on the ocean. Yeah, near the ocean. It sticks out. We're going to go there. It sticks out on a little island, and there's some other things to see there as well. But you go from there, from Syracuse, you go up to Catania, and then Messina is where Rhegium was, in the big city that Patton beat Montgomery to by hours, and raised the American flag ahead of Montgomery and the British. We got there first. How many people with British okay, good. I didn't offend too many. Yeah, but you rooted for Patton, didn't you?
I did.
Yeah. Okay. Good. All right. Gary.
We can't put that guy in a box. I know some people have heard of him, photographic memories, and they can store with the Holy Spirit. I believe that guy didn't have to use a book and pencil. He could do it the next month or the following year.
Yeah.
Yeah.
We can't put everybody at our level. You know what I mean?
Yeah, the question, the observation that Gary made is that Luke could have had a photographic memory where he just kept the details there and they came to mind, but never forget that all Scripture is inspired by God, is God breathed. It's little a author and big A author, and the big A author never loses in what's written down. He says this is how it's going to be. Little a author puts it in his own unique style, but it's never against what God wants written down. So little a, Luke, took all the facts, stored them away, or, as Ken said, he was writing around the deck, writing down it. One way or another, Luke wrote down.
That's what happened. God made it happen.
Yeah, God made it happen. All right, other questions? All right, yes, Paul.
Paul's enslavement, who is that the author of?
Yeah, the book Paul's Enslavement is, again, by Mark Fairchild. I could read you his blurb if you want. Mark Fairchild teaches at Drew University right now, and he travels around the world. He's a Fulbright scholar. He's an archaeologist that's discovered more things in the last 30, 40 years than any archaeologist I know. Most important, he's written a good book on it, is the sunken church of Nicaea, which he found by accident, and now they're doing underwater work there. Yeah, where the Nicene Creed was written. So he's the guy that I read his book, and he leads tours for Tutku, and he's brilliant. And so I really believe that what he wrote and what other people support what he said is that somehow Paul was enslaved at one time. I think it was his parents that were enslaved. Paul was a part of a slave family, and his parents had benevolent master who freed the family, gave citizenship, which was essential to Paul's mission. And remember, the synagogue of the freedmen that were at the heart of the insurrection against the way, the early church, were part of the synagogue of the freedmen. They came, a lot of them from Cilicia, where Paul was. They found some really good, really interesting find in Jerusalem about 10 years ago, where there's a description that says synagogue of freedmen. It did exist. It was composed of Jews who received their citizenship one way or another and formed a synagogue of freedmen. They hated the church. And I really think, and this is just me, but I think based on what they did at the beginning, their venom towards Stephen and laying their cloaks at Paul, these guys were connected. And so when Paul went on his Gestapo-like rage against a Christian church all around the region, these guys were his guys. They hated. And these were the guys, I think, that eventually, back up in Cilicia, heard about what Paul was doing, and in Galatia began chasing him and persecuting him until they finally found him in Rome again. And this was all through Turkey, from the east to the west they chased, and then they chased him down Greece, and finally in Jerusalem. So that's just my opinion. And it's not gospel, neither is what he says gospel, but it's a pretty good opinion, I think. I do, yeah. Citizenship important, key to his mission. All right, other thoughts? Winding down. Let's pray. We'll get you out of here early. Frank will go another half hour next door. I'm teasing. Let's pray. Father, thank you for your word. Thank you for our magnificent Apostle Paul and the example he gives to us. Thank you for the miracles that you kept bringing around on this tiny small island on Malta, Syracuse. God, you're in charge. You're even in charge now when our faith is under assault by a new Suleiman the Magnificent, the Suleiman that shares the same master, one that hates you and your church. Father, help us resist. Help us love, though. Let us advance our gospel with love as it's been advanced for 2,000 years, and not the sword. We thank you, we praise you, in Jesus' name, amen. Give a Kleenex. I need a Kleenex. I've been fairly dripping the whole. I'll take anything. Yeah.
Use it. So you can bring it back.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you.